Do you remember the last time the Washington Wizards had a good season? For many NBA fans, it was back in 2016. Led by the dynamic trio of John Wall, Bradley Beal, and Otto Porter Jr., the Wizards finished the season with 49 wins. But how about we set the bar to 50? Going through the archives, you could find ups and downs, promises and disappointment, but you couldn't find a single 50-win season until 1979. It took us to the distant past, back in the glory days of the crotch strangling jean shorts. People were still listening to music on cassette players, and the winner of the 1979 NBA Finals, Seattle Supersonics, played their last game back in 2008. So now the question is, how does this perennial underachiever of a franchise end up here? The Washington Wizards is quietly one of the most poorly run franchises in the league. But unlike their counterparts, such as Minnesota, Charlotte, or Sacramento Kings, they somehow manage to fly under the radar. It's as if people forget they even exist. Starting from 2000, the Wizards have been trapped in a perpetual cycle of crippling mediocrity. Their best season so far was in 2017. The Wizards that year won 49 games, just one shy of 50. In comparison, during that same period of time, the San Antonio Spurs have recorded 18 consecutive seasons with more than 50 wins. The Wizards were certainly no match for the Spurs, but they were far from the worst either. In the 21st century, the worst season they had was in 2009, when they only won 19 games. There are 17 different NBA teams, with at least one season worse than that since the 2000s. That is more than half of the league. Despite being the physical embodiment of average, their overall record looked shockingly bleak. Statistically, they were actually the worst NBA team of the 21st century. Starting from the year 2000, the Wizards have recorded 819 wins over 1,113 losses in the regular season, which is by far the lowest winning percentage among all NBA teams. But they rank the highest when it comes to longest conference final drought, with 44 seasons. They haven't made it that far into the playoffs since the 1970s. I don't know why, but Washington decided to run their franchise in the least exciting way possible. Year after year, this irrelevant team deliberately aims for mediocrity, and they achieved this by first. It is truly surprising to me how little people talk about the terrible draft history of the Washington Wizards, because they are truly no strangers to drafting busts. In 2001, the Wizards drafted Kwame Brown. The 6'11" big man once promised Jordan that he will not regret drafting him, but picking him ahead of Paul Gasol, Tony Parker, and 6 other All-Stars was probably the biggest regret anyone could ever have. In 2011, they picked Jan Vesely 6th overall, who was thought to be the European version of Blake Griffin. Vesely wasn't able to fly across the court like Blake, but he still managed to fly himself back to Europe after only 3 abysmal seasons in the NBA. Meanwhile, players selected after him, such as Klay, Kawhi, and Jimmy, all became superstar players. The second round of the NBA draft is somewhere you can find a diamond in the rough, but you wouldn't know it from looking at the draft history of the Washington Wizards. Here are all 16 players they drafted in the second round since 2000. A lot of them didn't play a single game for the Wizards, while the others had a minimal impact even when playing. Only 4 of them lasted a full season before being waived or released. The lack of success wasn't limited to just second-round picks. Out of the 15 players they drafted in the first round, only Bradley Beal and John Wall became All-Stars, while the rest of the picks were mostly wasted. After being traded to the Lakers, Rui Hachimura was the latest Wizards to be moved during his rookie contract, and he was no exception. Only 4 players drafted made it beyond their 4th season, and even out of those 4, 2 were traded during their 5th and 6th year respectively. Their draft selections were not the only reasons holding them back. The Wizards have always been a victim of horribly inflated contracts. Davis Bertans has only one valuable skill on the NBA floor. He can shoot the ball pretty well. Other than that, he had very little to provide for a team. He grabbed only 2.5 rebounds despite being 6'10". He barely creates opportunities for his teammates, averaging only 1 assist per game. Besides, Bertans has consistently one of the worst defensive ratings in the league. But nonetheless, the Wizards still gave him a 5-year $80 million contract in 2020. It was easily one of the worst contracts in the league, and there are plenty more examples like this. In 2016, Ian Mahinmi was given $64 million to be a bench warmer. In 2008, they handed Arenas $111 million despite a bad knee injury. He then responded by pulling out a gun on his teammate, and then the rest is history. For every Bertans and Arenas on the team, there is a promising young talent that the Wizards gave up too soon. For example, 3/5 of this iconic championship team actually began their NBA careers in Washington. By his 3rd season with the Wizards, Richard Hamilton was already averaging 20 points per game. However, they traded him for Jarek Stackhouse, a stat-padding ball hog who led the team absolutely nowhere. Rasheed Wallace was another example of a high lottery pick given up too early. Despite being the 4th pick, he was sent to Portland after just 1 season. He then became a 4-time NBA All-Star. Last but not least, Ben Wallace was initially picked up by Washington after being undrafted, but they traded their future defensive centerpiece away in 1999. We are just scratching the surface so far. Chris Webber, Earl Monroe, and many others all had much greater success after leaving the Wizards. Most NBA teams are either contending or rebuilding, but the Washington Wizards seem to be the rare exception. They are a team that constantly plays for the 8th seed, but that only makes it harder for them to find valuable talents through the draft. To make matters even worse, their aggressive free agent signings hardly ever work out. They are also terrible at evaluating young players, allowing future stars to slip through their fingers. And that's why the Wizards have been stuck in this vicious cycle of mediocrity.